Welcome back. In the last class, we looked at measurement unit and default values. In this class, let's see how conflicts are resolved in CSS. You see, the possibility of having multiple declarations targeting the same element on a page is always there. And when that happens, we say there is a conflict. In most cases, the source of the conflict may be in the fact that the CSS declarations that can apply to an element are in different CSS files or coming from different sources, such that there is more than one CSS declarations targeting the same element. When this is the case, the browser must find a way to resolve the conflict. And the way the browser resolves the conflict is by cascading through the different declarations, determining the importance of each declaration, what we call the specificity of the selectors, and of course, the sequence or order of arrangement of the different declarations, or in short, the source order. When the conflicting declarations are finally resolved, the value obtained is what is called the cascaded value. So with some example, let's see how conflicts are resolved in CSS. Back in the index.html file, now let's see how we can target in different ways this h1 element so that we can create an artificial conflict. All right, so let's go to the main.css. Now, right now, I have the heading 1 already targeted here and apply a font size of 4M. But this is not the only way I could target this element, considering the fact that it's in a container called hero. So I could target it like this by going through the container and say h1. This time, let me give it a font size of 3M. So now I have a conflict because the two font sizes here are applying to the same element h1 on the page. So the question is, which of these font sizes will get applied? Well, you may guess that it is the hero h1, but let's look at it and confirm it ourselves. So here in the browser, inspect the source. This is the h1. If I select that now, you see that the font size of 3M is what get applied, while the font size of 4M is cancelled out, meaning that the font size of 3M's wins. That is, the selector hero h1 wins over the element selector h1. Now, this may look normal to you, knowing that normally the declarations that come after another targeting the same element get applied. So you don't really think there's anything special happening here. You believe that normally it should be this font size 3M's that get applied. But let me change the order and see what happens. So if I call this and I place it above the element selector h1, preview again, you see that the font size is still 3M, irrespective of the source order. Now, so what does this mean? Recall that I said previously that when conflict occurs in CSS, there are three factors that the browser deploys to resolve the conflict. One, the importance of the different declarations, the specificity, which we will explain in a second, and the source order. Now, right now, these two selectors have the same importance, or these two declarations have the same importance in that none of them has the keyword important applied to it. And I'm sure you've seen the word important applied to a CSS declaration. Right now, this is the declaration that wins in this conflict. But let me put importance in this place, the keyword important, and let's save the file and preview again. If I refresh and check my style, you see now that the font size of 4M is applied and the font size of 3M cancelled out, which means that the browser is telling you that though on the basis of factors that usually should be considered first, the 3M's is rated higher, but because you include important, you make this declaration more important, every other consideration is cancelled out. So what this means is that whenever I use the word important in a declaration, that declaration wins over every other similar declaration targeting the same element. So that's the first thing the browser uses to determine the value that is applied when multiple declarations conflict. The moment the browser sees the word important, it doesn't bother to check the other declarations. It knows automatically that you want that particular declarations to win. Good. Now, after declaration, if there is still a conflict, then what happens is that the browser will then calculate what is called the specificity. So, for a moment, let me take out the important again. So we look at the second factor, which is specificity. Now, what is specificity? Specificity is simply how specific a declaration is to an element. Now, when you look at H1 here, H1 here means just any H1, which means that if I have 10 H1 on the page, this H1 will apply to all of them. But this one here is more specific in that it is addressing an H1 that is inside a class called hero. So it is more specific. So in terms of specificity, this one is more specific than just the element selector H1. But it is not just as simple as a face value there. There's actually a way it is calculated. And the way it is calculated is, let me give a comment here, is that when you have a CSS being applied to the HTML directly in what we call inline CSS, that inline CSS usually win over any other declarations. And after inline CSS, you have what is called the ID selector. And after ID selector, you have class and pseudo class, pseudo. And after that, you can have element selector. You have element selector and pseudo element, of course. So when you look at this order now, right now, there is no inline CSS in our code. Inline CSS is what you apply to your HTML when you say style, and so on, and you apply the CSS. So that's inline CSS, but we don't have it here. Okay, and for each of these considerations, there is a score of 1 assigned. So now, since there's no inline CSS, then the ID is next. But looking at my HTML, there's no place I have ID selector there. So that means, again, for ID, there's no value assigned. Then the next thing there is class. And if we check it now, here, this selector has one class. So if I come down here and I say that selector has 1 for that class, next is element selector. And that element selector also gets 1. So that means altogether, the specificity of this selector hero H1 equals to 2. Now, if I come to this one, there's no ID selector, there's no class selector. What I have is just an element selector, so it takes 1. And ultimately, it gets 1 for its specificity. Another way we could look at this specificity is called weight, is to say the weight of each selector. So this is heavier, the hero H1 is heavier than this. And that's why it gets applied when the important keyword is not attached to this. So this is how specificity is calculated. Now, let me go a step further. Let's say here, in this H1, I attach a class again, which I call maybe primary heading. And this time, I come here and say H1 that has a class of primary heading to it and font size of 6A. Now, if you look at what I've just done here, I've created a class called primary heading and I've attached to that same H1. So that means now that there are 3 conflicting declarations. One for the hero H1, H1 primary heading, and H1. So at this point, you ask which one gets applied. But before we get to the browser and check which one gets applied, let's do a bit of calculations for the specificity. So if I come here, the specificity for this class or this selector is, look at it, I have an H1 there, that's an element selector. So it has 1. Plus, I have a class selector, that's another 1, and that gives me 2. So that means I have a specificity value of 2 for this selector as well as for this selector. So that's a tie there somehow. But first, let's go to the browser and see which of the declarations get applied. You see that my H1 now has balloon. So again, if you look at it, you see that font size 6M get applied and the other font sizes get cancelled out. 4 and 3 get cancelled out while 6 get applied. But hey, wait a minute. I thought that both hero H1 and primary heading have the same specificity value of 2. Well, we don't expect that the word should come to an end if there is a tie. And that is where the third consideration, which is source order, matters. This case now, the browser observed that this selector has a specificity value of 2 as well as this selector. Therefore, there is a tie. So what is considered in order to determine the cascaded value is the source order. In other words, which one comes later? And this is the one that comes later between these two. As it is now, this one is already out of the equation because its specificity value is 1. So it is totally out of the equation. It's not considered at all. The battle is between these two, this hero H1 and H1 primary heading. And because there is a tie there in terms of their value specificity, then the third consideration that the browser uses to calculate the cascaded value kicks in, and that is the source order. That is the order of declaration. And in terms of the order of declaration, the heading 1 primary heading comes after hero heading 1. So that's why it gets applied. So these are the ways that the browser determines which value is applied when there are multiple declarations targeting the same element. Well, you may argue that this is not going to happen in a typical design. I'm not sure anybody is going to write this hero H1 and at the same time write this and at the same time write this. Well, you may be correct, but considering the fact that your declarations may be coming from different sources, not only the one you write, it is important that you understand how the value that is applied is arrived at. Now, the use of important, you may have seen it in some CSS files. All right. In most cases, it is common when you're using a third-party theme or a third-party CSS. Now, the author of such third-party CSS knows that it is possible that there will be some declarations in a CSS that may conflict with whoever is going to use his third-party theme or file. Therefore, because of that, you often see plenty important in third-party CSS files. It is to ensure that the files that or the declarations that they put in those files get applied. After all, the reasons you use a third-party themes is because you want to use their style, not your style. All right, so that's one thing you should note. Another thing again is for your own CSS file, the use of important should be a last resort, meaning that it's not something you just use every time. As a matter of fact, if you find yourself needing an important, that's a pointer to the fact that you may have made some mistakes in your CSS. So it makes sense to debug and find out where that conflict is rather than tie the browser's hands by using the word important. So what you learn here is that browser resolve conflict by using 3-factor, important, specificity, and source order. And importance there is adding the word important to the declaration. Source order is which one comes last. And of course, specificity, you've seen the way it is calculated here, is which one has the bigger weight, which one is more specific. So putting these 3 factors together, the browser is able to determine which declaration wins when there are multiple declarations targeting the same element. And I believe at the end of this class now, you now understand which declarations will get applied when you write your CSS. So you don't get surprised when you see certain values and you're wondering how on earth does this value get applied when I'm expecting this to get applied. So that's it. And I see you in the next lesson.